Welcome to the PDB Situation Report. I'm Mike Baker, your eyes and ears on the world stage. All right, let's get briefed. We'll begin today's show with the Trump administration's efforts to reform the federal government. Well, good luck with that. And specifically, its targeting of USAID. That's the agency ostensibly responsible for administering civilian foreign aid. Former Congressman Jim Renacci will join us to give his insight on that. Later in the program, President Trump issued an executive order last month to declassify records related to the assassinations of President John F. Kennedy, former Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. Now, author Gerald Posner, he's spent a lot of time researching these assassinations. He'll stop by to explain what we should and shouldn't expect to learn in the coming days. But first, today's PDB Spotlight. President Trump and DOGE are taking a sledgehammer to the United States Agency for International Development, announcing massive layoffs and then folding that remnants of USAID into the State Department. To some, USAID was a pillar of American soft power, providing aid, shaping global influence, and furthering U.S. interests abroad. To others, well, it was a taxpayer-funded boondoggle. And when was the last time you heard the word boondoggle? Propping up far-left pet projects, including DEI initiatives worldwide. What? Well, that's true. So what's the reality? Is USAID an essential tool for diplomacy? Or is it bureaucratic waste? Or is it something in between? Well, joining me now to break it down is former Ohio Congressman Jim Renacci. Congressman, thank you very much for taking the time to join us here on the Situation Report.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, no, absolutely. Well, let's start out with how would I refer to this? It could be a salacious question, but if you wouldn't mind, you've spent a lot of time looking at the issue of government spending, of USAID and waste and fraud in government. What are the most egregious cases of wasteful spending that you've seen in your experience with USAID?
Well, look, anything that doesn't relate to a requirement to benefit the United States government and taxpayers, in my mind, is an egregious situation. Whether you're buying condoms for, one country or, what all these things that we're hearing, they're all egregious. Because in the end, what we really want to have is we want to, that entity was formed in 1991 under the Kennedy administration. And the goal really was to make sure that other countries around the world realized that the United States was a friend. Because if we remember, back then we had a Cold War and we had Russia doing the exact same thing. So that was the purpose. Now the purpose of the organization still should be doing some of that. And remember, China today is the enemy that is doing a little bit of that around the world too. So anything that relates to making sure that other countries realize that the United States is as far as I'm concerned, we're trying to build our relationship. That's a positive thing, but not condoms, not all this other egregious things, DEI programs. That has nothing to do with the purpose of this organization.
Yeah, I think just for the benefit of our Situation Report viewers, the reference to condoms is, and we talked about this on the PDB. We highlighted it as a story, believe it or not. I think it was actually the first condom story we've done on the PDB. But there apparently was upwards of, depending on who you talk to, upwards of $100 million set aside for a health initiative that included tens of millions of dollars of condoms for the residents of Gaza. So I thought we'd get that out on the table. So I take your point, and I agree 100%. Look, there's a real need for however you want to refer to it, a tool of diplomacy, the use or the extension of soft power from America, and that was, you're absolutely right, that was a key element of this, the driver behind USAID at the outset. But how did it change, right? At what point is it too much autonomy with USAID? So is this a matter of not shutting it down, but reimagining it, perhaps as an element of a different organization?
You know what's happened, and it's one of the reasons I left Congress. I was so frustrated. Here I'm a successful businessman. You got to look at your expenditures. We weren't doing it. Congress has no oversight on these agencies. Congress is not doing a budget on an annual basis. Congress is not doing all of their spending reviews. All of this is a normal job of the United States Congress. We have appropriations bills that are supposed to be passed. We have budgets that are supposed to be passed. Most of your listeners don't realize we haven't done that probably for 25 to 30 years, if you go back to where we've really done both, which is
why
pass
not?
a
I mean, I
budget.
guess that's going to shock. I'm sorry for interrupting, but that's going to shock a lot of people. How could they not have oversight of expenditures from an organization like USAID, or how could they have just dropped the ball on their other responsibilities in terms of audits and efficiency when Congress holds the purse strings?
Well, remember, that's the number one goal of Congress. They do hold the purse strings, but what they should be doing is they should be passing a budget, and then they should be passing appropriations bills. The appropriations bills would say, USAID, you only have this much money, and this is what it's supposed to be spent for. We're not doing that. Congress isn't doing that. And at the same time, we should be passing a budget that says, hey, USAID, what are you doing? And let's zero base this out and determine what you should be doing. Those are the real inner workings of Washington that aren't getting accomplished and aren't getting completed.
But why not? I guess that's the big question that I have, and I suspect a lot of people have listening to you talk about this.
Yeah, well, look, it's one of the reasons when I was there, we couldn't get a budget passed when we tried to cut costs, and that's why we get the CRs. And I don't know if your listeners understand what a CR is, but it's just a continuing resolution which says we're going to allow all these agencies to continue to spend their money. And that's the real problem in Washington. You can't, like, and I was a member of Congress, but you can't blame President Biden, you can't blame Bush, you can't blame if you're not doing your job. You gotta blame Congress for not doing enough oversight. Now, here's why I give President Trump a whole lot of credit. He probably doesn't have the authority to do some of the things he's doing, and that's what the Democrats are complaining about. They're saying he doesn't have this authority, he can't cut this cost, and it's probably true, and there'll be lawsuits about it, but I think he learned from 2017 to 2020 that if he doesn't do this, Congress won't do it. And I love what he's doing because it's forcing Congress and the American people to start saying, hey, what is going on here?
Yeah, I want to circle back to USAID specifically, but before I do, I just want to drill down a little bit more because I mean, I'm fascinated by this. I would have assumed that an organization such as USAID every year would be required to submit a proposal for their budget, and they would have line items. Now, obviously, there will be certain events that come up, one-offs and events of the moment that have to be dealt with in an ad hoc manner. But for the most part, I would imagine that they were proposing a budget, and that Congress would then, whether it's OMB or whomever, would then be going through that budget and approving it sort of on a line item basis. That doesn't happen from what you're saying.
No, it doesn't. And look, it may not even be a line item. They may say we're gonna spend, $20 million in Africa, or we're gonna spend $10 million in this country. They should at least be doing that, and then Congress should be looking at what they're spending it on, and that should be the oversight. So that's a twofold thing that should be done by Congress. Remember, that's also the number one goal of Congress, oversight, and we're not doing enough of that. So I really do blame Congress for a lot of this. If we pass budgets that said, in total, we're going to spend X amount of dollars and for aid to other countries, and then in the appropriations bills, you say, we're going to allocate $50 million or $50 billion or whatever the number is to USAID, but we want you doing X, Y, and Z. Then you approve all that, and then you come back and you do oversight over what USAID is doing. That's the job of Congress.
I could spend all day talking to you about this because I am just fascinated by the inability of Washington D.C. to just get crap done, do their job, right? And look, I run a business, and if we didn't, question where every dollar went when somebody came to us and proposed a budget, or if our clients, said, don't worry about a budget, you spend what you need to, that'll be fine. Now, okay, to be fair, that would be a happy day from a business perspective, but it doesn't happen. So let's focus again. I don't want to disappear down that rabbit hole, but let's focus on USAID in particular. Do you imagine that what could happen? I know this is speculation, but do you imagine that what could happen is we end up with a much smaller entity that is placed underneath the control and management and oversight of the State Department?
For that, because I do think we have to have an agency that's under control of the State Department, and that should be a division of the Secretary of State's office. These are expenditures, again, to promote the United States around the world, and the influence of the United States versus China, versus Russia. That's the whole goal of USAID. But we've gotten away from that, and there's no oversight. So I think if you take that organization and you put it under the Secretary of State, which is what we have now, that's what President Trump has done, and then you ask the Secretary of State to monitor and oversee those expenditures, but you also have to have Congress to agree to spending. See, that's the key. And I know people get mad at this, but it's Washington. In Washington, it's Congress's job to authorize and approve expenditures. They have the power of the purse. The president does not have the power of the purse. And what we have now is the president saying, hey, you're not doing your job. I'm going to take some of that power away and I'm going to just cut it. And you're going to have to do your oversight and all those things, especially when it comes to USAID. But look, we could talk about every agency without a budget, without appropriation bills. We are on a steady stream of spending and no oversight.
Do you think the president has overstepped in terms of, again, just focusing on USAID? Do you think he's overstepped his authority?
Well, I would tell you this. In 2017, the president tried to cut spending in USAID, and I think it's the budget office came back and ruled that it was not proper for him to do that. It was the Impounding Act, I think is what it's called. It's the Impoundment Control Act. So they said back then, President Trump, you can't do this. This is authorized by Congress. You're not allowed to do this. Now, President Trump oversees those agencies, so he should have some authority to oversee what they're spending. But this organization was set up back in 1961, authorized by Congress to be an independent agency, which might be a problem, which means we might have to change that. So I think we got to look at all of these things, because here's the problem with Washington. What was good in 1961 might not be necessary in 2025. And I think we're running into some of that now.
Why was it set up as an independent agency? Why would it be given that sort of autonomy if, in fact, it is designed to be a tool of projection of U.S. diplomacy and power and influence?
I think back then, the president at the time, President Kennedy, was trying to show that he wasn't the person directing the funds, and there was an independent agency authorized by Congress to direct the funds. Again, could have been the right thing to do back then. Might need to be changed today.
Yeah. I don't know that it takes a rocket scientist or anybody with any government experience to imagine that that's problematic, to say you're going to set up an autonomous, independent organization to spend money. I don't have any issue with the current administration, with the Trump administration, saying we're going to take a fine-tooth comb to every dollar that goes out. Every tax dollar that goes out, that the U.S. government spends, to ensure that it is in in the best interests of the American taxpayer, of U.S. national security, et cetera. How do you feel, and again, I know this was sort of soft science, I'm asking you for opinion rather than talking about facts, but how do you feel about how the Trump administration went after USAID? It was fairly, what should I say, aggressive, sort of a weekend purge of their offices in a way.
Well, first I want to go back. When you talk about Congress authorizing organizations, they do that all the time. They authorize the organization to oversee banks. They separated it. Congress has no authority over it. That was a law passed, and all they have to do is fund it. So you have this organization out there building buildings, paying for buildings, renovating buildings, overseeing our financial systems after the 2007 collapse, and yet there's no oversight or accountability. So that organization is also set up as a separate, distinct organization that can't be controlled by Congress. Now, it can be stopped, it can be eliminated. When it comes out, President Trump did this. Look, I think he's just so fed up with the inability for Congress to do things. He is doing things quickly, and he's moving very fast. I think he pauses after. This is probably one of those he probably needed to pause before he did everything he did. But again, I'm sure he is so frustrated and he wants to move the needle. He doesn't have a lot of time. President Trump's got 4 more years and probably only 2 more years, because we all know that 2 years into a current president term, they usually lose members of the House and members of the Senate. I'm not saying that's going to happen here, but I think if you look at history, it's going to. So this president has 2 years and he can't wait. And for that, you have to applaud him. Now, there will be a tremendous amount of lawsuits and there'll be a tremendous amount of pushback. But in the end, this is a wake up for the United States Congress.
Do you think it's going to have any impact? I mean, it sounds like the U.S. Congress has been fairly sort of an inert body for a long time. So even with this sort of shock and awe start to the Trump administration, do you think it ultimately makes any difference, or are we just going to see continued dysfunction? I hate to sound so cynical, and I don't mean to denigrate all the people that work hard up on Capitol Hill, because there's a bunch of them, but I'm curious.
Well, here's what I do think. I think it's going to alert the American people. The American people are frustrated as well. And we keep putting people back in Washington doing the same thing over and over again. And if nothing else, I think this will be a wake-up call to the voters that says, look, if these guys or women are not going to do their job, we got to replace them with people that will. And I think that will be the best thing that happens out of all this.
Okay. Congressman Renacci, if you wouldn't mind, we have to take a quick break, but if you'll stay right where you are, we'll be back shortly with the next segment of the Situation Report. Thank you again for joining us. Welcome back to the Situation Report. Joining me once again is former Congressman from the state of Ohio, the great state of Ohio, and of course that would be the home of the Ohio State, Congressman Jim Renacci. Congressman, thanks again for sticking around. Very much appreciated. If you wouldn't mind, could you talk a bit about the current effort by the Trump administration to generate, what would we call them, buyouts, I guess, from the federal workforce?
It's a good way of eliminating staff, non-productive staff. The problem with that is, you got to think of it from this standpoint. The president doesn't have the authority to do that. And I saw that there's already been a court case thrown at him. And the authority is he's spending money that he's not allowed to spend without the approval of Congress. And those buyouts probably need to be approved by Congress. But in the end, I think he's sitting back saying, Washington won't do this. Congress won't pass this. I'm going to test it. I'm going to keep doing these executive orders, and I'm going to move as quickly as I can. We'll see if Congress catches up, but it will also shake up, I hope, the voters to say, hey, wait a minute, this is probably something that should be done.
Yeah, I know it's not apples to apples, but it strikes me a little bit as if, I mean, if the pushback is, well, you don't have the authority to spend that money, you could say what under President Biden looking to uh, forgive student loans. And I know it's not apples to apples, but it's pretty close.
Yeah, well, President Biden was forgiving student loans. He didn't have the authority to do that either. That's a cost to the federal government. And you're right. These will be the same things. These will be lawsuits. And again, I see this as an awakening. And it's going to be awakening for the American voter and the American taxpayer to say, wait a minute, maybe the president should have that authority, or members of Congress, you need to start doing your job, because that's really where this is going to end up being directed to.
Yeah. No, I take your point. I think you're absolutely spot on in terms of the mindset in the White House. It's a very good point. I think they're just saying, look, we're gonna do these. We may get pushback on some of them, and they already have on some of these executive orders. But I think they're just saying, we're just going to keep putting them on the table and signing them. And if you want to push back, fine. But we've got an agenda, and we're going to pursue it. What would you do if you were put in charge of everything, and you were going? Oh, let's put it a different way. If you were in charge of DOGE, the Government Efficiency Department, now headed by Elon Musk. If you were in charge of that, what would you go after to have the most impact on the government waste?
See, here's the problem, and I talk about this all the time, because I really was someone in Washington who looked at spending. And if you look at the drivers of our debt, what is really driving our debt, we bring in about $4.5 trillion a year into the Treasury. We spend about $6 trillion a year. We spend about $4.5 trillion on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest. So we're approximately at a break even just paying for those programs. Then you have $1.5 million or 1.5 trillion in deficit approximately every year. Half of that is the military. So when you really start saying, how do I get this budget in place and fix it? Number one, you got to start looking at the drivers. And look, nobody that's an elected official wants to talk about that, but there is waste in Social Security. There is waste in Medicare. There is waste in Medicare and Medicaid. We need to look at all of those programs, because those are the biggest spending items. Now, this aid to other countries, I mean, it's about $40 billion a year on a $6.5 trillion spend. So it's money that needs to be looked at, but it's not enough to fix the problems. You started by asking me if I was totally in power. The answer would be, there's two things we need to do in America and the United States to fix our federal system. We need to require a balanced budget. That would really shake things up. And then we need to require term limits, because those that stick around, they stick around because they like to keep spending the money. If everybody was termed out after so many years and you were required to balance a budget, we would fix all of these problems very quickly.
We are on the exact same sheet of music. I've been banging about term limits for I don't know how long. I don't believe that it's going to happen. I think there's too much self-interest in Washington, D.C., but I think you're spot on. Until you get those term limits in place, whatever they may be, extend the term for a congressman to 4 years, right? Nobody's rushing to get out of D.C. to go back to their farm, right? So times have changed. So, maybe you get 2 4-year terms as a congressman, maybe you get 2 6-year terms as a senator, but then you leave, right? You take that self-interest out of there, and I think it has an amazing impact on people's ability to make bigger, bolder, braver decisions, because they're not wrapped up in their own self-interest of getting reelected on a constant basis. I will now climb down off my soapbox, Congressman. What about?
By the way, I 100% agree with those numbers. I've said it. It should be 8 years for members of Congress. It should be 2 6-year terms for Senate. We should put those term limits in place, and we should require them to balance the budget. It will be an amazing change for our country.
All right. Well, we're gonna start a movement here. I think we already have. I think I hear the drumbeat right outside of my hotel room. What about the eligibility age for Social Security? I know I'm about to hit that third rail, but is that ever likely to happen? Because again, we want a benefits package that's going to stick around, right? That's going to be feasible and solvent going forward. So, do you think that's something that Washington could ever approach? Because again, under your theory of like what was good in '61 when USAID was started may not be relevant today. Life expectancy and the time that people work and continue to work, that's changed. But do you think realistically that that's something that could be taken care of by Washington?
By the way, it's already being done. Your full retirement now this year is 66 years old in 8 months. So we have moved from 65. But let me tell you the real problems with Social Security that nobody really pays attention to. Number one, the program was designed 45 years ago, assuming that people would die at age 65. That doesn't happen. So they're slowly moving the age limit up. But we're also taking all the funds that are going into this impress fund, which, by the way, Congress is not allowed to touch, and we're only investing it in treasury bills. Now think about that. A treasury bill is averaging about 1 or 2% a year, and that's the only place you're allowed to put Social Security funds into. You got to go back to President Bush, where he wanted to allow Social Security Trust Fund to invest in the stock market. Well, if you would have invested in the stock market back when President Bush, George W. was in office, we've averaged about a 10 or 12% return all those years versus about a 2% return. Inflation has averaged about 3.5%. So our return is not even keeping up with inflation. So that's one issue. But there's also other changes that have been added to Social Security. Your spouse, either spouse, may never have worked or put money into Social Security yet. When the one spouse files for Social Security, the wife can collect, or the husband can collect 50% of whatever that person, the one spouse put in. So think of that number. We're not even keeping up to make up for the one spouse, and yet the other spouse, who may have never put a dime in, can collect 50%. There are problems inside the system that need to be changed more than just raising the retirement age. That should be done too. But I just named off 3 things that could make the system solvent if they were just looked at.
Yeah, I remember that moment in time when President Bush, his administration, pushed the idea of investing in the stock market, and the pushback was fairly remarkable, particularly from the Democrats, arguing that, oh my God, the White House wants to gamble with your savings and your so. Yeah, I think a lot of people have the same feeling, and again, that speaks to in part why President Trump is now president. The frustration over inaction, the frustration over wasteful spending, lack of oversight, all of these things. But I agree also with what you said earlier. There's a limited time frame. There's a limited time frame. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Congressman.
I was going to say, remember, President Trump has said he doesn't want to touch Medicare and Medicaid or Social Security, but let me give you another thing for your listeners to really think about. Medicare, the reason Medicare, the average couple puts in about $150,000 in their lifetime. They take out about $340,000. These are numbers you can find in the statistics. I was on the budget committee, but where does most of the spending occur? It occurs in the last 100 days of the individual's life. So when you bring that up, you cause a whole nother issue, but it's something we need to look at. If the majority of spending is in the last 100 days of somebody's life, how do we change it so that, right now we're spending twice as much as we're putting in Medicare. It's another program, and the driver of that is that last 100 days. Another touchy subject, something nobody wants to talk about, but it's an issue we need to at least address.
Yeah. Well, no, if anybody up on Washington on Capitol Hill goes after that, then they know that they're going to lose the next election. So that brings us back around the circle of life, brings us back around to term limits. Congressman Jim Renacci, look, this has been fascinating, and I very much appreciate your time. We've got a lot of other things we could talk about, and I would love for you to come back and have another conversation with us on the Situation Report.
Love to do it. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. Thank you, sir. All right. Coming up, President Trump, maybe you've heard about this. He's ordered the release of the remaining files on the JFK, the RFK, and MLK assassinations. What's in them? Well, that's a good question that you should ask. And what might we finally learn? Is there a smoking gun in there, or is it just going to be an unsatisfying release? Gerald Posner, he spent a lot of time looking at these assassinations. He's the author of Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK. He stops by to share his insight on those. Welcome back to the Situation Report. Within days of taking office, President Trump signed an executive order. Well, he signed a bunch of them, but he signed an executive order declassifying all remaining federal records related to the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. Now, the order directs intelligence agencies and the Justice Department to release these files in full, citing the public's right to transparency. For decades, records on these cases have been withheld or heavily redacted, with previous administrations, including the first term for President Trump, delaying full disclosure. Supporters say this move could finally put conspiracy theories to rest, or could it? Revealing the full scope of government investigations. Now, skeptics argue that it might raise more questions than answers, and you can count me as one of the skeptics. So what should we expect from these long secret files? And will they change our understanding of these assassinations? Joining me now is Gerald Posner. He's a great author, and he's an investigative journalist, and he's written two great books, Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK, and also Killing the Dream, James Earl Ray and the Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Gerald, thanks very much for joining us today. You know, honestly, we could spend a handful of hours talking about this. I got a long list of questions, but I'm going to be mindful of time. I just want to get one thing out of the way. Correct me if I'm wrong. You started, I don't want to say conspiracy theorists, because that I think sometimes makes light of people who have alternative views. But you started, your belief system with JFK, thinking that there was more to it than Lee Harvey Oswald. And that has evolved. Talk to me about that process.
Yeah, you're right, Mike. Look, nobody approaches a controversial historical subject without some prejudgment. Then you have to find out if you're right or not. So when I started looking into the Kennedy assassination in the early 90s, after the Oliver Stone film, my inkling was that maybe the mob had some role in a conspiracy because of Jack Ruby's, the nightclub owner from Dallas, who murdered Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused assassin, 48 hours later in police custody. So you can't look at that and not immediately think maybe there's something to that. Are they doing a silencing of the accused assassin? So I went in suspicious, but then you end up following the evidence. And what I returned to my publisher, Random House at the time, with was whatever conspiracies might have been brewing against Jack Kennedy, there were people who wanted him dead. Lee Oswald wasn't part of any plot. He got up in that window in the place that he worked in Dallas in 1963 for his own warped motivations. My publisher was pretty downcast at first. You know, they had let me off for a year and a half to look into the case. And I came back and said, the Warren Commission got a lot of things wrong. The ballistics can be updated. There's new evidence, but they got the basic conclusion right that it was Oswald alone. They said, really? And that's sort of where the evidence takes you.
Yeah. I can imagine what that meeting was like when you put that on their desk. Because again, look, it's a theory, it's a conspiracy because it's got legs, right? It's people want to believe that there was something more than just one individual who created such a world-shaking event.
Right.
But in looking at this upcoming release, hopefully it's a full release of the JFK files. What do you expect to see out of this?
So what I'm interested in is I don't think there will be a smoking gun there. By the way, all of these files have been seen before by a government organization in the late 90s, the Assassination Review Board. They then passed 35,000 over to the National Archives with some type of redaction, some of them withheld in full. Now we're down to about 3,000 to 3,500. There's not a precise count. That's what everyone wants to see. About 500 of those are fully redacted. No one's seen a page of them. But guess what? 499 are tax files of Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, the companies that Oswald had worked for. So let's get the tax files out there. Then the rest of the documents, there are about 400 that have just a social security number redacted of somebody who worked for the church committee in the 70s or somebody who worked for the Assassination Review Board for the Congress in the late 70s. If you have a social security number and somebody's alive, you can keep it redacted, keep it away from the identity thieves. But for the most part, these files can be released in full. And what I think they might show is that your former employer, the CIA, knew a little bit more about Oswald's unhinged behavior 6 weeks before the assassination when he visited the Soviet and Cuban missions in Mexico City. And then the question is, did they do anything with it? And we know the answer to that is not. Do anything means pass it over to the FBI when he came back into the United States, but it's not how they do things.
Well, yeah, at that point in time, kind of looking at the atmospherics of it all and the interplay between the CIA and FBI, they didn't play well together, back in the 60s, 70s, you could argue in the 80s, and to some degree in the 90s. So I think you're spot on, right? And I've talked about this before, that because there would seem to be, and I take your point about a social security number. Yes, that always gets redacted, fine. But it would seem to me that what we're going to see is going to be very unsatisfying for people, but it's going to speak to this idea that Oswald was on the radar from a counterintelligence perspective of the agency, of the CIA, and perhaps, to some degree they had conversation with the FBI. But I think there's an element of embarrassment here that shows that they weren't proactive enough to prevent this tragedy from happening.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. As a matter of fact, it's very interesting because the FBI had an open investigation on Oswald. The CIA had him on the radar because he had defected to the Soviet Union in 1959. It was in the press. He comes back to the United States with a young Russian bride. He's handing out leaflets on the streets of New Orleans just months before he goes to Mexico City, trying to get people to join his new pro-Castro organization. And what's interesting is, we have to remember, this is the heart of the Cold War. Just a year earlier, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which the two superpowers came to a standoff that led us to the edge of World War III. There are no Cuban diplomatic missions or embassies in the United States. We've kicked them all out. The closest one to us, proximity-wise, was in Mexico City. So the CIA definitely had eyes on both the Cuban mission and on the Soviets. Now, not many Americans walked into those two missions and asked for a visa to go and join Castro's revolution down in Havana. And now you get a guy who does it, who had been a defector to the Soviet Union. And at one point, we know from the KGB agents who saw Oswald at the Soviet mission, who years later told their story, Oswald took out his .38 caliber revolver, slammed it on the desk at one point. One of the KGB agents grabs it, empties it of its bullets. They have a meeting afterwards in which they view him as sort of, unstable, to say the least. The question is, what did the CIA have in terms of ears and eyes on those two embassies? Did we have a human asset inside one or more of them that we had turned? Did we have video surveillance? Did we have audio? Because afterwards, Win Scott, who was the chief for Mexico City for the CIA, said, oh, well, we did catch somebody on video, but it turns out not to be Oswald, and the cameras weren't working all the time. And then when it came to sound recordings, there was a sound recording played for a Warren Commission counsel, and then later there were none that were ever found. So whatever the agency had, it did not want to disclose how it had penetrated two of its enemies, the Soviet Union and the Cubans, in the middle of the Cold War. So they didn't give any of that over to the commission.
Yeah, no, look, I know that this is for people listening, right? This is going to be, again, I'll use the word unsatisfying. I don't know how many people have approached me or talked to me over the past many years who are certain of how he was killed. They just know it, right? And there's a variety of different theories, but it always involves sort of a cabal, whether it's the mob and the agency, whether it's others. Look, Gerald, if you'll stay with us, we've got to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back. Welcome back to the PDB Situation Report. Joining me once again is author Gerald Posner. He's the author of Case Closed, Lee Harvey Oswald and the Assassination of JFK, and also the author of Killing the Dream, James Earl Ray and the Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Gerald, thank you again for sticking around. Very much appreciated. We've got a lot to cover here, and I don't think we'll be able to do it all in one episode, so I'm roping you into future episodes. Let's pick up on Oswald. And you commented in our earlier conversation that he had visited the Soviet embassy, the Cuban embassy in Mexico. I can almost guarantee you that, yes, he was under surveillance by the agency. From a counterintelligence perspective, that's exactly what would happen. I don't know to what degree they were sharing information with the FBI, but I do know from my time that sometimes that information sharing was seriously lacking, and it certainly would have been worse back in the 60s and 70s when they didn't play well together. From your perspective, what are the chances? I mean, we always talk about, or people who look at this a lot, they talk about the mob involvement in it, this agency involvement in it. What's the possibility that the Soviets and the Cubans, because look, Oswald was desperate to show his value to the revolution, right? I mean, he had an unsatisfactory living experience in St. Petersburg, but he was still keen to prove his worth, basically, to the communist leaders. What's the chances that they saw that, and while they may have thought, as you pointed out, that he was somewhat unhinged, perhaps they saw him as someone they could turn, and they did, and used him to carry out the assassination? Do you think there's any merit in that?
I think there could be, Mike, on the Cuban end. On the Soviet end, the reason I say no is, I was the first journalist to interview Yuri Nosenko, the defector who James Jesus Angleton thought was a fake defector, gave me long interviews. I talked to Necheparenko, the Kostakov, the other KGB agents who ended up in Mexico City. Let me tell you, they had watched him when he had defected Oswald. He tried to kill himself when they told him to leave Russia. They didn't want him there. Then they moved him out to Minsk. They kept all types of surveillance on him. They knew he was unstable. And so if they wanted to do an operation that would involve taking a possible hit at the president of the United States, they couldn't trust somebody like him, because if it unraveled, that was World War III. The Cubans, on the other hand, were willing to play a little bit more aggressive. And although they may not have said to him, go and try to find a job so you can kill the president, they may have given him some encouragement. And that's why I believe everybody is looking at the U.S. files in the National Archives. I'm wondering why we don't call on, well, we have no relations with them. That's why we don't do it. But the Cubans could have information on this, but the others are the Mexicans. We do have a friendly relationship with the Mexican government. Mexican intelligence was watching these embassies as well as monitoring the U.S. to see what we were doing. They wanted to make sure that although it was a nest of spies, everybody played by some rules, so it wasn't playing out in violence on their soil. So Mexican intelligence files have never been released from this period. They may well have had more intelligence on Oswald during his social time, when he was outside of the Soviet and Cuban embassies, going to these parties where he was with other people, than we actually picked up in terms of the American intelligence. So I'd love to see what the Mexicans have.
Yeah, that's an intriguing point. I would be somewhat skeptical that they would have much to add. I don't know why I say that, other than I just think given that time period, I don't know that they had the capabilities from a intel service. But I think it's definitely worth pursuing, like everything else, right? I mean, everything's speculation until we see everything that's out there, which is one of the reasons I'm hoping this is a full release of the remaining material for JFK. But with Oswald, I want to keep kind of digging into this, right? Because again, there's this notion that there were forces at play, and typically those forces are the mob and the agency, the CIA. Talk to me a little bit about one thing that always kind of stands out, which is how interesting an individual, if it was just Oswald, one individual goes out there and kills Kennedy. And then one individual, Jack Ruby, makes his way in, gets close access, and kills Oswald. So talk to me about Jack Ruby and what your insight provides to us.
Yeah, I mean, Ruby's one of the major reasons, that not only I was suspicious in the beginning, but a lot of people from the get-go just say there has to be something more to this. When you actually investigate Ruby, I have more on him, I think, in the book than anybody had published at that time, sort of following him from before the assassination through every minute afterwards. He's really a guy who's a wannabe mobster. He's not a made man. He's not part of the mob, but he wants to be a tough guy. He throws people. He's his own bouncer at his club, his nightclub. He throws people out. He pulls a gun on them once in a while. And in Jack Ruby's world, this guy, Oswald, had killed the president of the United States. And Ruby, when he gets the opportunity on a Sunday, he walks down the street and they're about to bring Oswald out and transfer him from the Dallas police over to the sheriff. He sees this rampway, he walks down, and when he pulls his gun out and kills Oswald, it's almost the spur of the moment. He thinks the people are going to clap him on the back and say, Jack, you did the right thing. You cleaned the stain from the Dallas. You eliminated the guy who killed the president. And when he's tackled by the cops, Mike, he says, hey, you know me, it's Jack. It's Jack. All the cops knew him because they used to hang out at his club. He thinks he's going to get at the most what's called murder without malice. It was a Texas charge in the 1960s, maximum sentence 5 years, sort of like a manslaughter charge. He's stunned when he gets convicted of murder. One last thing on Oswald, by the way, when you talk about, being part of a plot, how he could have been. He took a bus ride down to Mexico City. That's how he got there. 3 different buses. It takes him overnight. When he's traveling to Mexico City 6 weeks before the assassination, September 26th and 27th, that's when the White House puts out a notice for the first time that Kennedy is going to be visiting Texas in November. So every idea for a plot, for time and place, could not have happened before that announcement from the White House. Then Oswald tries to get to Cuba. He's rejected. A week and a half later, he comes back into Texas. So you have to look for a group, whether you want to say it's the mob, the Russians, the Cubans, the CIA, whoever. They have to bring him into a plot. There's only a month and a half when he's in Dallas before that assassination. That's what I always challenge everybody to do. Show me a scrap of evidence. Show me something credible, a telephone call, a person, somebody reaching out to him. It's not like today when you can send a text, send a social media or direct message. You had to have some type of contact. It's a very narrow window. And that's where it really falls down, where you just can't find Oswald in contact with anybody other than his Russian wife and his friends were hosting her out in Irving, Texas.
Okay, that's it's a very valid point. I know right now there's a lot of people watching this and and throwing things at the TV because it's never going to be settled. My argument with the release of the documents is always the same, which is okay, they got to release them, but don't imagine somehow that it's going to put all of this to rest. Because again, as you pointed out earlier on, I don't think there's going to be a smoking gun. Let's pivot real quick to Martin Luther King, because I've been fascinated with that assassination of MLK for some time, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I usually have found over the years in terms of investigations that once you do get the evidence in front of you, once you do find information, there tends to be a relatively straightforward answer, and oftentimes life's not as complicated as we might imagine. But with MLK, it's a little bit different, and I've thought for some time now that there's more here. And by that, I mean that there are other factors at play. Now, with James Earl Ray, how do you square this loop, right? How do you say that this was the act of an individual who couldn't even keep himself out of jail for petty crimes, right? I mean, he was a failure, basically. And yet somehow he ends up looking like a university professor after dusting himself off or kind of going off the radar for a period of time. And then he ends up in Europe where he gets arrested eventually. Talk to me about the MLK situation and what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, so it's interesting, by the way, because Oswald, when he killed Kennedy, was just turned 24 years old. We forget how young he was, and often, as you know, the people in their 20s might grow out of that feeling that they want to change the world through a bullet, and in their 50s, if it didn't happen, they might just be sitting around and watching old reruns on TV. Ray was 40, was a year older than Martin Luther King. It's unusual all of a sudden at 40 to turn yourself on to become an assassin, and I believe that Ray is more of an enigma, a tougher case to solve. In the end, I'm convinced that Ray would have gone to prison and only stayed silent for one reason, and that was to protect family. No one else. He would have turned anyone else in. He had 2 brothers who were also ex-cons, and I think that they were looking for a payday out of a racist lawyer in St. Louis who was offering up to a $50,000 bounty. Doesn't sound like a lot to kill Martin Luther King Jr. when you think of what a life is worth. But for the Rays, that was like hitting a lottery ticket. And Ray thought it was possible. And what was his goal? His goal was to get to White Run, Rhodesia, or South Africa afterwards, because he thought he would have some safe haven there. So if you follow it, it's a small kitchen conspiracy. It is for money. And in the end, it's wider. But when I tell that to people, or they read the book, they're disappointed, Mike, because when I say conspiracy, they want a deep state conspiracy. They want a conspiracy with J. Hoover behind a fence in a dress, shooting at Martin Luther King or something like that. They don't want the shorter story of, an assassin doing it for payday.
Yeah, look, nobody wants J. Edgar Hoover in a dress. Thank you for that visual, and all the viewers of the Situation Report. Thank you for that visual. So you think essentially it was the act of an individual in a sense, right? It was him going after this bounty, as opposed to the involvement of the feds in any way.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, the feds were down the street that day in terms of Army intelligence, FBI. The security divisions that were down the street in a firehouse, not far. They had visuals on where King was staying at the hotel, at the Lorraine Motel, but they weren't there to protect him. They were there to spy on him, as you know. And one of the interesting things I don't know if Trump was aware of when he signed the executive order that said, let's release the MLK files as well. MLK's family came out and said, we'd like to see the files beforehand. And the reason they said that is in the late 70s, when the House Select Committee finished its work, the Black Caucus was the one that said, we don't want everything out, because in those files are FBI surveillance tapes that were illegally obtained on King's private life, audio tapes and video recordings to show that he was a philanderer. J. Edgar Hoover intended to embarrass him and disgrace him in public. So that material's in the files, clearly has nothing to do with the assassination, and it should not be made public.
Yeah, I agree with the first part. I agree with the concept that the reason why they're concerned, and likely what we'll learn from the release of those files, are all sort of the atmospherics and the result of all that wiretapping and the surveillance that was going on Martin Luther King. And so I understand why the family would be pushing back and saying, we want to see everything before you release it to the public. But I would say this is I think if we have another situation here, look, it was 2017 when President Trump said let's review, and then it turns out that he did keep things still classified. I think if we go through that route again this time around, and there's material that's held back, I don't even know how do you explain that, right? And more to the point, you would have to explain it. You would have to do a better job as a government to say, this is why after all this time we are not releasing these pages or this material.
I think you're right. They put themselves into a corner on this because, I mean, you may have a different view of this, but one of the reasons, there are a number of reasons that I don't think Pompeo is in Trump 2.0 is because Trump feels a little bit had on the fact that it was Pompeo that argued very, very well when he was running the CIA that some of the documents in 2017 on the Kennedy assassination should still be withheld for confidentiality reasons. Any
idea? Let me ask you this. I'm sorry for interrupting, Gerald, but I'm mindful of time. But any idea or insight or thought as to why that was the case? Why fight, to keep these things classified? It can't just be because they don't want to release some social security numbers, right? I mean, and if that's the case, then say, you see that line right there? That's a social security number that we've redacted. So what is it from your perspective, right? Because everybody's got crazy ideas about why they're not releasing this material or what they would expect to find if they saw it.
So you asked such a great question, and the answer is so unsatisfying. I'll give you just one quick example. One of the things that I and others who have studied the assassination have wanted for years was Angleton's testimony, his before the church committee in 75. They had redacted large portions of that. Then they released some of it in 2017, some in 2018, some in 2022. So still Pompeo and others are saying there are parts of this that cannot be released and redacted. In 2023, we finally got the entire thing. And Mike, guess what? I'm happy to send these to you, but you know what they actually are redacting? They're redacting the fact that a Romanian defector was defected to the Norwegians and apparently exposed a great deal of the intelligence activity of Romania against Norway. And then there are words that are redacted, for instance, on another page. We passed it along to the French. It was taken by two sources to, and here's the new words, French counterintelligence. It very clearly showed that redacted Romanian and Soviet services. And this is, I say to myself, you were fighting to keep this secret after 60 years when people look at it and think that you're hiding some secret about who killed Kennedy. That's crazy. And in my view, they overclassified in these instances, and then they've held on to those classifications too long.
Well, that's been the history frankly, of intelligence operations, is overclassification, right? I mean, that's just, you throw out a big net because, okay, it's a human, instinct. I think you want to be more protective than not, right? You don't want to make a mistake, and so you tend to overclassify. But it has been a problem, and it's been a problem for decades. And so I think going into this, if they don't do a full release and just say, here you go, is everything, because again, I don't believe there's a smoking gun in any of those files, RFK included. But I think it's time, get that out there. Look, we've got a lot more. I've got a book here with all my questions for you, and we haven't gotten through 50% of them. So that means you got to come back, Gerald, and I hope you will.
I will, Mike. And I think also, no matter what the files show, you're going to get RFK Jr. asking Trump to form some type of commission to look for files elsewhere. So if there's no smoking gun in the files that are released, it's not going to stop those who really believe that their government killed these political leaders and civic leaders. They're going to keep looking elsewhere. And so I just don't think that all of a sudden it's over, no matter, even if the release turns out to be very, very mundane.
Yeah, no, 100%. This is not putting anything to bed, but I think it's time to get it all on the table. And then, yes, if there's other avenues to investigate, by all means, let's do it, right? But anyhow, listen, Gerald Posner, thank you so much, man, for taking the time. And I hope you'll come back next time we call.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, that's all the time we have for the PDB Situation Report for this weekend. If you have any questions or comments, you know what to do with them, right? Fax them to me or write them on a postcard and mail them to me, or just email them or text them, whatever. Or you could reach out to me at pdb@thefirsttv.com, because every month we take some of your best questions and comments, and there's a lot of good ones in there. And we mush them all together into what we call our Ask Me Anything episodes. Right, and keep it within reason, all right? Polite questions only, or comments. To listen to the podcast of this show ad-free, well, it's simple. Become a premium member of the President's Daily Brief by visiting pdbpremium.com. It couldn't be any simpler. I'm Mike Baker, and until next time, well, you know the drill. Stay informed, stay safe, stay cool.